I'm Josh Busby. I'm an assistant professor here in the LBJ school. I'm an assistant professor here at the LBJ school, and we're very fortunate to have Michael Levi from the Council on Foreign Relations here tonight. He's the David M. Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and Environment at the Council on Foreign Relations and Director of the CFR Program on Energy Security and Climate Change. Tonight he's going to be talking about rebuilding the global climate regime. Dr. Levi started out his career as a physicist before turning to the study of international relations. I think we first met maybe in 2003 or 2004 at Brookings Institution, and he's since moved on to the Council, of course. His training in the natural sciences has certainly served him well in the study of nuclear security issues, including his 2007 book on nuclear terrorism. More recently, Dr. Levi's been writing on climate change and energy policy. He's a prolific writer and commentator on varied topics, including in such journals as Foreign Affairs and other outlets, as well as his incisive blog posts and Twitter feed. Dr. Levi brings a level-headed search for policies that can work in the complex arena of climate and energy, where sharp, evidence-driven assessment and nimble thinking are often in short supply. So welcome, Dr. Levi, and we're excited to hear your remarks tonight.
Thanks, Josh, for the kind introduction. I hate to agree that sharp and nimble thinking is in short supply, but I'll say that in the small set of people that I go to talk about ideas in this area and to think through concrete policy options, Josh is one of the few that I count as a really helpful and essential person to think through these problems with. I want to take a step back this afternoon and look at the last couple years of climate diplomacy, because they've been a fascinating couple years, both the tick-tock of the negotiations, but also in what they tell us about how we might be able to deal with climate change, and in what they tell us about some of our assumptions about how this sort of diplomacy and how these sorts of international efforts work. And then I may say a little bit as well about the clean energy technology dynamic that's evolving internationally that I think is at least as important a piece of the international scene on climate change as the formal UN negotiations. I want to start our tour in January 2009, not because that's when climate diplomacy started. Climate diplomacy has been going on for a long time. And not even because this is somehow the first administration which came into office in January 2009 that took this seriously. There were serious discussions already underway, first around the Kyoto Protocol and in the rest of the world in trying to bring that into force. And then in the later years of the Bush administration, as the world prepared to find a successor to Kyoto. Kyoto had been agreed in the late 1990s, put into force in the mid-2000s, and the deal was that developed countries would cut their emissions by a certain amount by 2012. That was called the end of the first commitment period. And developing countries participated in schemes that would pay them to cut their emissions. The problem was that after 2012, the space was pretty open. In theory, there was supposed to be another round under Kyoto, another set of commitments, but nothing was in stone. And everyone agreed that by the end of 2009 in Copenhagen, at the 15th Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, they would agree on a successor. And they put out some basic guidelines at their annual conference in 2007, that time in Bali, and set to it. But people were pretty timid about negotiating before early 2009 because the United States was such a critical player and because it was clear that the administration would change. And not just because it might be the Obama administration, but because from both parties, the presidential candidates were coming into office saying they were serious about climate, proposing to put significant domestic programs in place and to re-engage in the international process. Obviously, President Obama had promised to take action, but John McCain had been one of the few senators out there proposing cap-and-trade systems back for several years and bringing them to votes in the Senate. And the basic outline of how things were supposed to turn out was also quite clear to a lot of people. The United States would pass comprehensive climate legislation. The world would conclude a legally binding agreement that would be a successor to the Kyoto Protocol. It would include a global carbon trading scheme. And it wouldn't be unfair to go so far as to say this wasn't just predicted by a lot of people, but was regarded by a lot of people as essential. That this was not just a way to deal with the global climate problem, it was the essential way to deal with the global climate problem. And that is what framed a lot of the thinking around the world as we headed into 2009. It's what framed a lot of the media coverage. And even within that frame, while the start was rocky, it was pretty decent. In the first part of 2009, the House of Representatives passed the first ever comprehensive cap and trade bill. There were quibbles about whether it was as good as it could be. There was a lot of opposition. It was a tough route to passage, but it passed, and things seemed to many people to be moving in the right direction. If we look back, that was probably the high point for cap and trade legislation. It foundered on a variety of fronts as the year went on, amid economic concerns broadly, where people were uncertain about their future and weren't particularly eager to experiment with new schemes. It had previously been sold primarily on the virtue of being a market-based system at a time when labeling something market-based was a great bumper sticker. And it was now running into a situation where market-based was instead a negative. It got caught up in some peculiar budgeting tricks that ended up getting it labeled cap and tax, which made it somewhat toxic, and of course intense partisanship and a stark focus on healthcare also distracted attention from following through. But at the international level, this again was seen as relatively positive, and people pushed themselves to be as optimistic as possible about what could happen in the United States. And it's important again to remember that in much of the rest of the world, and in a lot of the United States, US action was seen as the necessary and sufficient condition to making the comprehensive international deal happen. On the international front, there were three basic threads. The main focus was on the UN climate negotiations, which include, at the time it was I think 191, maybe 192 countries. It's now 193. One country added itself during Copenhagen, and I think one added itself the next year. That was the central effort, but there were several other components. Within the formal negotiations, where people were trying to develop long texts to satisfy all the different concerns out there, usually at a technical negotiator level, there was essentially no progress for much, if not most of the year. In large part because there was no political consensus for the technical negotiators to implement. So people went to their meetings, they talked a lot, they made progress on small, discrete issues, but they were unable to make progress on the big pieces because they were putting this technical piece ahead of political agreement. There were two other big areas of concentration, though, over the year. The first is what we call minilateral efforts, efforts with smaller groups of countries, and there were two big ones that worked somewhat in tandem. One was called the Major Economies Meetings. That had been launched early in 2009 as a new incarnation of what the Bush administration had begun as the Major Economies Forum. And it included it was 17 major economies. They weren't allowed to be called major emitters because it would upset them. And on the other hand, major economies flattered many of them, and it helped convince them to participate. And they would come together, and the idea was in a smaller group, you could make more progress. And on top of that, there were some other interesting innovations. When the United States invited negotiators, they strongly encouraged states not just to send their diplomats, but to send people from multiple departments. So you would bring in finance ministry, energy ministry, foreign ministry, and hopefully get some fresh thinking around the table. There was also tied closely to that an effort within the G20 process. You have to remember, this is happening in a context where you have this global financial and economic crisis. The G20 has come together and been surprisingly cohesive early on. It has made significant changes in governance at the IMF, the World Bank, and it's been seen as somewhat successful, and people are looking for other things for it to take on. And climate change seems like a natural fit. The two come together in July of 2009 in Italy, where they tried to put in place a series of basic elements. The G8 meets first and agrees on a few basic pieces. They want to try and limit global temperature rises to 2 degrees. Because that's quite ambiguous, they say what this means is we need to cut global emissions in half by mid-century, and that within that context, developed countries will cut their emissions by 80% by mid-century. But when they step back to the broader G20 major economies meeting group, they can get the 2 degrees precisely because it's fairly ambiguous, but they are unable to get agreement even on the total numbers for the world, let alone what the numbers would be for developed countries in aggregate. And that is not a first sign at an analytical level, but perhaps at a political level, it's a first sign that even the basics that a lot of people think may be straightforward are going to be very difficult to put in place. The third major channel that's going on here is the US-China avenue. And the United States in particular has staked a lot on this, not just in dealing with climate change, but as a way to build a constructive element to the broader bilateral relationship that might spill over into progress more broadly. And the basic idea is that they're going to work on more technical matters. They're going to work on technology cooperation, creating new centers, new efforts. That will translate into confidence, which will lead to the potential for political compromise. Now, for that process to properly play out, you need many years. In this case, they have some months. So there's a real direct push on the political side as well. And there's significant progress on the technology front over the course of the year. But the effort to move on the political front is considerably more difficult. Now, a lot of this comes to a head in September and October of 2009. There's a growing realization that there isn't going to be a legally binding agreement in Copenhagen. And there are two basic schools that come at that particular conclusion. The first school basically says, we don't have enough time. The basic project is sound, but the United States isn't going to have a climate bill in place. That's the soft version. So we can't do the broader deal. Or even if the US did have a climate bill in place, there would be so many other things that we would still need to do that we just don't have time to sort it out. The second, and I personally subscribe to this school, was that the fundamental objective was flawed for a fairly substantial variety of reasons. The first is that no one had really bothered to figure out what they meant by legally binding. They wanted something that was called legally binding, but they hadn't really figured out why it was useful or what it would mean to put it in place. A surprising number of people hadn't stepped back, for example, and asked about the Canadian performance under the Kyoto Protocol, where Canada had pledged substantial cuts, had done almost nothing to meet them, and despite it having been obligated under a legally binding treaty, was expecting to see no penalties. The second fundamental piece that people hadn't grappled with was that countries tend to not want to make commitments when they're extraordinarily uncertain about their ability to comply. And because the cost of emissions reducing technology is fairly uncertain, because even more important, the effectiveness of specific policies to promote its adoption is uncertain, and because the consequences of doing that are uncertain, it was extremely difficult for countries, and particularly developing countries, to take specific emissions objectives and say, we know that we're going to meet these. And it was even difficult for them to say, we're going to follow through with the following policies if we don't quite know how they're going to work out. The third big piece getting in the way of substantial progress is that the standard view of the deal was that, at least let's say in Europe, where a lot of the intellectual groundwork was laid, is that if everyone was going to take action, the West was going to pay for it. Okay, so the United States, Europe, Japan were going to be paying out a lot to make things happen. That was always a dicey proposition, and it became even more difficult as the economic situation worsened. Now, there were two possible conclusions from this kind of pessimistic assessment. One is that the world is all going to hell, can't do much about this. The other is that while there are flaws in the view of how to deal with things that people put forward, in terms of being able to realize it, there are also flaws in the assessment of why it's essential. And again, I fell into this camp, and so did a lot of other people, particularly in the United States. And here's the argument that a lot of us went through. Climate policy is fundamentally determined at the domestic level. The actions of firms and consumers and the emissions consequences of those actions are determined primarily by domestic incentives and domestic regulation. The key is to get the right sorts of domestic policies in place. The role of international action is to help knit together those policies to create a virtuous cycle of additional effort rather than a vicious cycle where each country does less because they think that others are doing less. And what that meant was that an international framework should be just that, a framework. It should provide transparency for countries' actions. It should provide some expectations roughly of what they're going to do, not just on their emissions, but on providing financial and technological support for others. But again, the international effort would be a supporting framework for everything else rather than a top-down effort. For most people deep in the negotiations, this more fundamental critique was a bridge too far to cross. They focused more on the "we're not ready yet" argument. So in the fall of 2009, they started to rally around an alternative approach, which came to be called one agreement, two steps. The idea was that in Copenhagen, people would come with the political foundations for an eventual deal, and then in the following year, the legal details would be fleshed out. And while people were down from that, enthusiasm suddenly started to pick up. First, there was a state visit from President Obama to China that went quite badly on most fronts, but appeared to go fairly well on the climate front. In addition to a variety of technological agreements, the two countries appeared to agree that they would, the words were, stand behind their commitments. And what that was understood to mean was, at least in the United States, was that both countries in Copenhagen would be willing to put forward plans and to submit to some sort of transparency. On top of that, there was a similar agreement when the Indian Prime Minister visited Washington the next month. Then Senators Kerry and Graham published a widely read op-ed in the New York Times signaling that they would try to build a bipartisan climate bill in the Senate. So there was an expectation that US legislation was back on the table. And then the heads of state from almost every country, including the United States and China, promised to show up in Copenhagen. And a lot of people saw that, again, as a signal that something big could be done. So that takes us to Copenhagen. And the high expectations were very quickly deflated. The first thing that happened that started to deflate expectations had nothing to do with the substance of the talks. It had to do with the process. I don't know if anyone else in this room was at those talks, but they were an extraordinary piece of chaos. I personally was stuck outside in sub-freezing temperatures for about 8 hours, lost my voice for the whole week. And worse than that, I was out there alongside reporters from almost every major newspaper. And I'll tell you, it's really easy to write a story about how they can't figure out how to get you in the building. How can they figure out how to negotiate a climate treaty? And that was the tone that was set for the whole discussions. On top of that, again, other things like the top Chinese negotiator being locked out of the building for the first 3 days. Which does not lend itself to constructive negotiations. But the other striking thing was that while, at least in the United States, people had spent the year trying to dream up the ideal architecture that would make an agreement work properly, and that had been the case in a lot of other places too, the entire discussion was occupied by a very narrow debate over the Kyoto Protocol itself. The Kyoto Protocol prescribed a very specific way of dealing with the world. Developed countries took legally binding commitments. Developing countries were able to receive money. And there was an insistence that that not be gotten rid of. And that was a non-starter for the United States and Europe in particular. Not only was it a non-starter, they were not prepared to have that fight. And so the negotiations got sucked down into an insistence on sticking to Kyoto, which had become essentially a talisman for a lot of the developing world, for a lot of the environmental movement, and for a lot of people in Europe as well. That made it even more difficult to make progress on substance. On top of that, there was extraordinary solidarity amongst the developing countries and the big developing countries in particular. And you saw come to the fore a new coalition that people called the Basic Coalition: Brazil, South Africa, China, and India, which managed to hang together quite tightly to oppose several basic things. They did not want obligations to be transparent, they did not want legally binding commitments, and they did not want to get rid of the Kyoto Protocol. And so by the end, in the last couple days of the meeting, there was still no basic agreement on principles. It was a chaotic finale. We can take a variety of perspectives for what happened. I will give you one, how I see that it unfolded over the last couple days. The situation was quite deadlocked, and I should say this is a fairly US-centric view, but I think it's one a lot of people subscribe to. Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, shows up, gives a very surprising speech where she promises to try and raise, the US will participate in an effort to try and raise up to $100 billion a year by 2020 to help developing countries if everyone agrees to the other conditions, including commitments from the developing countries and transparency. And suddenly the dynamic changes. A large number of the smaller countries that are poised to receive some of that money turn on the bigger developing countries. And not just the smaller ones. Indonesia, for example, which is prepared to receive a lot of money to help preserve its forests, suddenly breaks and demands publicly that China submit to transparency measures. And a lot of this pressure starts coming down. It all comes together at the end of the last day of the negotiations, where President Obama, Premier Wen, the heads of the other basic countries negotiate face-to-face on the final details of an agreement that comes to be called the Copenhagen Accord. It parallels a lot of what happens 6 months earlier in the G20 meetings. There's a 2-degree goal. There are no global targets for emissions reductions. There is a vague pledge to submit to some transparency measures. There is a vague pledge to raise money. And there's a promise from each country that they will turn in emissions goals by the end of January. The reactions around the world are wildly divergent. In Europe, it's seen as a complete disaster for 2 basic reasons. First, the form, it's not legally binding. I should say 3 reasons. Second, the process looks ugly. And third, if you add up the targets and the goals that each country says it's going to achieve, they don't get you to the 2 degrees that everyone in Europe wants to achieve. In China, there's mixed reaction to the agreement. Some of the press trashes it, some of it doesn't. There is some diversity in the Chinese press. But the biggest reaction is that the Chinese are shocked that they're getting blamed for whatever shortfalls there are, particularly in Europe. And the Chinese diplomatic corps launches a charm offensive in the region. So for example, they're in Maldives, a low-lying island that happens to also be in a strategic location within days, to really apologize for what has happened. So their big lesson immediately is that this is bad for their image, which they have taken great care to cultivate in the region. In the United States, the reaction is as positive as anywhere in the world. And part of that is tactical. A lot of environmental groups say, we think we have a better chance of passing a climate bill if we come out in favor of this agreement and say we're making progress internationally. But for some people, and again myself included, the deal actually lines up with a lot of what makes sense. It's a bottom-up effort that ties together national initiatives rather than trying to dictate things top-down. But let me take a step back before I say a bit about the following year. First, what lessons did we learn during Copenhagen that a lot of us hadn't incorporated in the year before? The first is that while most emissions in the world come from a small set of countries, the rest of the countries matter. And they matter in diplomatic processes. a large spectrum of people had begun to argue that you could do everything with 20 countries, or most things with 20 countries, because you could capture most emissions. The key dynamic in Copenhagen was when the vast bulk of developing countries put pressure on others to agree to a final deal. And that was critical in determining the outcome. So having a larger number of countries in negotiation does not always make it less efficient and less effective. Second, what I would call path dependence, and this is probably my physics hangover speaking with that term, path dependence matters. It is easier to defend the status quo, even if the status quo is not very good, than it is to put something new in place. And here I'm speaking specifically to the Kyoto Protocol. There was an enormous amount of intellectual work done trying to figure out what the right climate architecture was for the world in the years preceding Copenhagen. Almost none of it confronted the question of how do you move from here to there if people want to stick to the original status quo. And it turned out to be much easier and simpler to say, how come you're abandoning this, than to argue for something new based on its substance. Okay, so people did not wake up to that. And the third is a lot of people, particularly in the United States, again, tend to assume that the substance is what ultimately makes people buy into a particular agreement or effort. What is it that we're actually doing? And we tend to denigrate process to some extent. Copenhagen appeared to say that process matters at least a little. There was a huge part of the backlash against the Copenhagen result was that it was not formally adopted by the meeting. 6 or 7 countries objected, all relatively small countries, but because it was not formally adopted, it received additional backlash. Those were all bits of assessment that we could put in place at the time, but we were missing something huge, which was that Copenhagen wasn't a done deal. There were reams of analysis written about the upsides of the Copenhagen Accord, the downsides of the Copenhagen Accord. Very little was written about whether the Copenhagen Accord would be history within a year. But that was what the real focus of the next year became. It was not a done deal. It lacked full buy-in. It was agreed to under a lot of pressure in a circumstance where people disagreed on what it was that they had actually signed up to. The entire thing was underpinned by an expectation of US action that was not particularly realistic. And the combination of the ugly process and the public trashing of the accord made it pretty cheap to walk away if countries wanted to walk away afterwards. And that quickly became apparent. I mentioned earlier that countries were supposed to submit their emissions cutting plans by the end of January. That became an extraordinary struggle. For some time it appeared that China and India would both decide not to participate in the accord which they had helped agree to. There was also a goal in the United States and Europe of getting at least 100 countries to sign up. They thought a lot of countries would give it more weight, more legitimacy, quite sensible. It turned out to be very difficult and require a lot of intensive diplomacy to get countries to sign up. But that was sorted, and by the end of January, the focus of the international discussions moved on to Cancun, the site of the 16th and next negotiation, which would start in late November. If someone wants to ask in the Q&A, I'll tell you why it was moved to Cancun, which is kind of a fun story. More modest goals. I think people have been chastened a bit, but people weren't quite clear what those goals were. Was it to tie up loose ends, figure out the details of what transparency meant, to figure out details on financing? Was it to get more aggressive emissions targets? Was it to turn this into a legally binding agreement? Was it to start from scratch and come up with something new because Copenhagen had failed? And how was this going to be done in a context where the other pillars were not working all that well? The US-China relationship was first damaged by Copenhagen. It had been ugly from day one between the two countries. It was compounded in early 2010 by fights over arms sales to Taiwan, a visit by the Dalai Lama, At the same time, the major economies meetings, which had been a leader-level effort, was downgraded to a staff-level one. And the G20, which was once the darling of economic and financial governance, was hitting a lot of rocky times. There was a lot of strife. And the last thing people wanted to do was add a now even more difficult climate file to that, and people started to push climate out of the G20. On the domestic front, things looked slightly positive for a while. Senators Kerry, Graham, and Lieberman came together, developed a bill with a wide set of buy-ins from an enormous range of industry that one would never have imagined in the past would support a bill like that. In addition, support from a range of environmental groups. And that huge spectrum of support bought them essentially no votes. That was a shock. If you go back 10 years and imagine a bill to regulate a series of industries, all of which are in support of that bill, and where environmental groups are in support of the bill, the idea that you can only get maybe 40, maybe 50 votes on that would be shocking, but that's what happened. And on top of it, the final kill was delivered by the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. One of the central pieces of the deal in the Senate climate bill was a trade of a climate regulation in exchange for expanded offshore drilling, and that became politically impossible as soon as the oil spill happened. The consequence first was atmospheric, but it was also practical. With it went some of the potential for the US to cut its emissions, but even more important, a lot of the potential for the United States to deliver money that it had promised, even if vaguely, in Copenhagen. When we get to the UN talks, they're largely directionless. There is no love for Copenhagen. It becomes increasingly apparent that a lot of countries would like to see the Copenhagen Accord disappear. Working from scratch is also unproductive. The United States is unwilling to play ball. So when people arrive in Cancun by the end of the year, it's not clear what they're trying to accomplish. The United States wants a bare minimum of reinforcing the Copenhagen Accord by making progress on each of the different fronts, and it frankly wants to avoid blame for its lack of progress on the domestic front. China would like the transparency obligations of the Copenhagen Accord to go away, but it also really doesn't want to get blamed. Okay, it remembers the experience of Copenhagen well, and it does not want to go through it again. The Kyoto issue flares up immediately, with countries demanding again that Kyoto be preserved, and Japan comes out more bluntly than anyone has in the past and says, we're not participating in that, which also throws the discussions into disarray. But there are two bright spots that ultimately end up salvaging the discussions. The first is from India. The Indian Environment Minister steps up and makes a couple compromise proposals, one on transparency with some details, and the other on technology, which is traditionally a charged issue in the discussions, and they put forward some practical elements. Now, there's a poison pill in these. He says the condition for all of these is the continuation of Kyoto and more aggressive US emissions cutting actions, neither of which are going to happen at the talks. There's speculation, I would say probably correctly, in India that he has made this package deal in order to get the proposals out there, understanding full well that the hardline demands will probably be jettisoned by the end of the talks. But he comes under a lot of pressure at home. The other key element is the Mexican negotiators, who are much more experienced than the Danish ones were, and have thought through this. And they have decided to build a very inclusive process that makes everyone feel like they've contributed, that provides very few excuses for people to blame secret discussions and backroom deals. But the risk with this is because they are unwilling to do backroom deals and have secret discussions, they're not quite sure whether the compromises they are forging are going to work. So when it comes to the last day of the talks and they come and show a compromise proposal, they genuinely do not know whether it will be accepted by all the key parties. If you've read the newspaper accounts of Cancun, what you read is the Mexican negotiators skillfully put together something that everyone loved. What you do not read is that when they put that out there, they did not know that everyone was going to love it, and that the countries that went for it did not know what it was going to say. Frankly, If I were in US negotiator shoes and I had seen this text, I would have been very happy, but I would have been very uncertain as to whether the Chinese would agree to it, because it included essentially the Indian proposals with some softening, particularly on the transparency front. But it turned out, in the end, that because there were few excuses to blame on the process, and because so many countries had put pressure on China to play along, and its foreign ministry had become quite sensitive to that, China agrees to the deal, and it is adopted formally. The headlines, if you recall, are quite different from the ones around Copenhagen. They are extremely positive. Generally, the view is Copenhagen was a disaster, but Cancun was a wonderful success. So what are the lessons? Again, well, the first is that process actually can really matter. And I will say for myself, this is the biggest lesson I've taken from the last couple of years of the climate talks. Because Cancun and Copenhagen are basically the same agreement. Cancun is a more formal version, concluded in more orderly negotiations with slightly better food than the Copenhagen agreement from a year before. But the content and the balance and the political deal is basically the same. The difference is the process. And that turns out to be a significant difference. You have not seen in the last month and a half a big effort at backsliding from the key countries, even though they are committed to essentially the same things. The second is, once again, the small countries do matter. Here, the promise of financial gains is much less credible than at Copenhagen. Okay, Copenhagen, $100 billion a year sounds like a lot. It is a lot. Who knows if people can deliver, but maybe. By this past December, it's quite difficult to believe that that's actually going to happen in full, yet these countries still push to move forward, in large part, I suspect, because they want to be part of the process. Josh and I had a conversation before where we were discussing this a bit, and if the intellectual argument that a small group of countries can do things better, more efficiently to deal with climate change is true, and you threaten to people to move to a small set of countries if they can't succeed within big talks, well, they should probably say, please do that, you're going to solve the problem. But it turns out they really want the process, and they're willing to bring a lot of pressure to bear to keep it intact. The last lesson, though, and I think this is an incorrect lesson, is that the whole problem with Copenhagen was process. And there are a lot of people who've taken that away from Cancun as well. That read says that all we need to really do differently is get the process right. We can move back to the original Copenhagen program of a globally binding deal with targets for everyone if only we get the process right. That is a dangerous lesson to take because the fundamental problems with the approach to Copenhagen still remain. Now, during this year, you have that international negotiation. It obscures some other really important international advances and international developments on the climate front, because international climate diplomacy is not just about the UN process. And two developments stand out to me. The first is a fight in the middle of the year over a World Bank loan to South Africa to build a coal plant. Coal plants are usually really easy to finance, particularly in a country that's as solid as South Africa, but their loans get caught up in the financial crisis and they want the World Bank, which they have not turned to in the past, to bail them out. And there's a fight amongst the donor countries as to whether they are willing to finance a coal plant. And in the end, there's a very tight and tough fight, and there's an agreement on the part of South Africa to include some clean energy facilities and some other changes in policy as part of the package, but the coal plant goes ahead. The reason I say this is important is that while people are having theoretical discussions about climate financing in the UN talks, real rules for real money are being developed because actual projects need to be approved or denied through the World Bank, which is the key donor, and will be, if there is money through the UN process, a key conduit. So governance is being developed because reality is forcing it to be. The second big development is on the trade front. There is increasing rhetoric about a clean energy race, and late in the year, there's a call for the US government to launch WTO suit against China for solar subsidies. This is not a total surprise. There had been talk in China earlier in the year concerned that there would be a suit from Europe against Chinese solar manufacturers for being subsidized. But once again, you're seeing a clash of efforts connected to climate, in this case efforts to promote clean energy industries, and existing governance structures. And once again, the governance debate cannot be avoided. And so people have to confront it. And in the process, they are figuring out how to write the rules for governance on a key piece of climate change policy. These pieces are absolutely essential, and the technology one is in particular, and I want to turn to that for the last little bit here. Because increasingly on the domestic front, we're talking about climate change as a technology issue. You heard this in the State of the Union address, for example. You didn't hear climate change, but you heard the technology issue. And increasingly, you will see the international debate be focused on technology. Like I said, you've become used probably to hearing about climate change be talked about as a clean energy race. If you go back a few years, that is not how it was being framed. When there was non-trivial bipartisan support for action on climate, it was for action on climate. John McCain and Joe Lieberman did not talk about green jobs when they introduced their cap and trade bills. They focused on the risks due to climate change. But that's changed, and the drill is familiar. China is putting huge amounts of money into alternative energy. India has a dominant wind company. Brazil is putting money into biofuels. We're losing the race for the 20th century, as people argue. There are three big problems with this argument. The first is that the markets aren't there yet. There is no race to be won if there is not demand for clean energy, and there is not demand for clean energy at scale until we get our act together more broadly on policy. Second, the developments in these countries are very uneven. Yes, there is a lot going on, particularly in China, as well as in Brazil in certain areas, but this is mostly innovation on process. It is mostly bringing established technologies up to scale. It is not generally fundamental innovation. The third problem with the argument is it assumes that everything is win-lose, that if these countries advance, that we fall behind, and in some cases that's the case, but often it's not. Three colleagues of mine and I published a study last fall. I believe one of them is speaking here about his new book on China and Indian innovation next week, and I encourage people to come and listen to him. It's a fascinating book. We looked at at China, India, and Brazil, and looked at what was happening in each of them on clean energy technology, and we found that there were significant shortfalls in all, on policy, on existing capacity, and because of market structure. We also found big shortfalls in the United States. And our conclusion was that you needed to figure out a practical way to get the innovation systems and technology systems in these countries working together. In particular, there is a lot where the United States can push ideas forward and these countries can bring down costs, but it's not only a one-way street. This has to be fit into a bigger, sensible approach to competitiveness, but ultimately we need a system that works for that. And we focus on three basic elements, and I won't get deep into them now. The first is the United States needs to significantly increase its support for innovation at home. There's no point in talking about cross-border innovation if there aren't incentives to innovate at home. The second is that we need open markets so that companies can work together. Most energy technology cooperation is between companies, whether it's because they exchange goods, because they tie up together in joint investments, but you need an open system for trade, investment, solid protection of IPR, and those basics in order to have solid technology cooperation. And the third is government-government cooperation of the sort that the US and China have been successful in moving forward gradually to date, because there are market failures, and simply getting the markets to work openly doesn't solve all your problems for you. So let me step back and just give you a small set of basic things to take away as you look forward to the climate policy debate over the next year and, frankly, over the coming years. While there's been a lot of turmoil at the global level, I think it is fair to argue that we've actually done relatively well. Not relative to the problem. I don't think by any stretch we've solved the climate change problem, but relative to what actually can be done at the global level right now. If you're practical about the limits of international cooperation and about the limits of what can be done internationally in the absence of sufficient domestic action, we're actually doing decently internationally, particularly, to be honest, in the broad process. We need to consolidate those gains. We need to make sure we don't overreach. We will see the return of Kyoto as a fight once again at this year's climate talks, and we need to be prepared for it this time. Second, we need to focus on these other pieces of the regime that I mentioned, particularly the World Bank and WTO, but also other elements of what people are increasingly calling the regime complex for climate change. We need to be careful to be at least as invest at least as much effort in those pieces as we do in the UN process, and probably more. And finally, we need to get our act together at home. It's clear that we are not going to have significant action at home on climate change in the next few years. And there's no question that the odds are extremely high. But we need to rebuild a foundation so that when circumstances change, particularly economic circumstances, we can move forward with sensible and strong policy that allows us not only to deliver at home, but to play as constructive a role as possible on the international stage. I'll leave it at that, and I'll look forward to your questions. You want to sit down? Yeah. Excellent.
Well, we've got time for a few questions. I thought I'd moderate and take and collect several, and then we'll give Dr. Levi an opportunity to respond. So if you have a question, I think there's a mic that's going to be circulated right there. And so you can phrase your comment, or at least with a question mark at the end, and keep it brief so we can get as many in as possible.
Or you can make it a question.
All right. Questions?
No one ever wants to start. So I'm Kate Weaver. I'm at the LBJ School and the Strauss Center. I have a couple of questions about more of the specific outcomes of Cancun, specifically the proposed Green Climate Fund. I wonder if you could comment about the political and practical feasibility of this fund, and particularly how it ties into your comments about the role of the World Bank and sort of the center of the management of the regime complex for climate change. And then secondly, along the same lines, the $100 billion, that figure that has been sort of, it came out of Hillary Clinton's mouth and has been bounced around back and forth in policy debates. Where did that number come from? And what does it really mean? And finally, if you could just answer why Cancun, I'd appreciate it.
Let's take a couple more and then give Dr. Levi a chance to weigh in. Yeah.
Dr. Busby, Dr. Levi, I'm Brazilian. And I'm pretty curious about knowing about the role of subnational governments, just as the case of California here in the U.S. or São Paulo, which, according to my belief, has pushed Brazil to pledge a commitment in Copenhagen. And the second would be, what do you think about the relationship between U.S. and China regarding the trade? And there will be one day that it will go to some barriers to trade based on carbon. Don't you believe so?
Let's take one or two more, and then right over here on this side.
Okay.
You make me give another talk.
Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Levi. My name's Erica. I'm a student here. I was wondering, on the domestic side, what you think the constraints are on building the foundation for future action. You mentioned the bad economy, but is that the extent of it, or would you cite other factors?
All right. Let's take one more, and then we'll give him a chance to respond. And I'll enumerate all 6 questions that we've got embedded here. So we've got to make sure that he doesn't miss out on any one of them. All right, right here.
We only have a decade left before the 17% cut from both Copenhagen and Cancun is supposed to materialize. What do you think the prospects are of reaching the 17% cut relative to 2005?
All right. right, so we've got
Great questions.
Green Climate Fund, where did the $100 billion figure come in? The subnational governance question, what are the prospects for trade barriers? What are the major barriers on the domestic side here? And what are the prospects for meeting a 17% cut?
All right, so this is
You're
my
on.
second talk. Copenhagen Green Climate Fund, for those of you who aren't familiar, was something established in Copenhagen. It was basically it was signaled in Copenhagen, and the details were worked out some of the details were worked out in Cancun. I think the prospects for it as a structure are good. I think the prospects for there was a lot of care taken to setting up the governance structure, particularly in a way that might make it possible down the road for, let's say, the U.S. Congress to be willing to put money in it. A lot of the fights at Cancun had to do with making sure that the rules were in line with what will allow, let's say, the U.S. legally to actually put money in the thing. As far as actually getting money in there and getting money appropriate, I think it's a much tougher task. And that's up to the individual governments. But aside from some of the sort of smaller but rich countries, I think it's going to be quite tough. It may change over time, and if there's another lesson from the Copenhagen process and from the role of Kyoto in it, is that you can sometimes change the content, but that governance structure is often very hard to change. And so that's been another philosophical element. Given the choice between getting the sort of contributions that you want and getting the governance structure that you want, it was important to get the governance structure right in the first place. I'd also say, I don't think people see the World Bank as the center for the regime complex in general. I do think they see it as a central piece for the finance part. I think that was really tough. In theory, you want some pressure on the bank that someone else might be running this fund so that they handle it better and don't take as big fees or whatever you'd like. But the alternative risk of having it turn out very badly, I think, was too high. And for better or worse, a lot of developed countries have much more confidence in putting money through the bank than they do in putting money into anything else. On the $100 billion, where did it come from? What the heck does it mean? Well, it means a lot of things to different people, and the best statement on what it might mean comes from something called the High-Level Panel on Climate Finance, which was established through Copenhagen. The Secretary General convened, included political leaders and a few private types, which really goes through it. You can get it on the web, goes through in depth what this $100 billion can mean. I'll say what it does not mean. It does not mean a $100 billion check from official development assistance. This is mostly private money that people are talking about. The bigger question is what kinds of private money count and which don't. Where did the number come from? This is a great question. I think it's a combination of things. It's partly a European thing, just like the 2 degrees. You can ask where the heck the 2 degrees comes from, because I can promise you that if it was first proposed as a 3.6 degree Fahrenheit target, it would not have had the same kind of cachet. So it was a European idea. And so was the 100 billion euros, which was the original fund proposal. Became $100 billion in part because I'm just going to guess that Hillary Clinton didn't want to talk about a 100 billion euro fund. Also, there was a large, well-funded group called Climate Works that was quite influential with a lot of the delegations that did a lot of careful study trying to figure out how much climate finance might be needed to meet particular pathways that they had identified, and it lined up roughly with this 100 billion something target. So those are some of the basic pieces that I think explain where it came from. Subnational governments. So this is one of my favorites, my favorite topics in this, and the one to which I have the worst answer. So firstly, within the international negotiations directly, the subnational governments played an important sort of inspirational role, but not that important of a substantive role. So when Arnold Schwarzenegger showed up at Copenhagen and gave a talk, there were more people crowding around TVs to watch that than any other part of the conference, okay? But he didn't participate in the negotiations, and frankly, most of the subnational governments had no clue what was going on in the real negotiations. Like a lot of other participants, they were there, they were still talking about targets and about carbon markets when the negotiators had passed way beyond that. I think Sao Paulo is a special case of internal influence within Brazil and able to bring the Brazilian government along in an important way. But I think this is a question actually that goes beyond the climate space, is that as subnational governments are increasingly involved in global issues, how do you harness them besides saying, well, they're going to implement a variety pieces of a proposal, or they may provide a laboratory, and then the federal folks will engage. And we're going to confront this in this country in a big way. When California gets its cap and trade system going, it is going to try to link up with other countries. California will have, I mean, California's has always had a foreign policy in the sense of trade, but California will have a foreign policy in a much broader sense. What happens when California establishes a carbon trading agreement with a Chinese province? Then 10 years from now, the US puts together a cap and trade system and says, we don't think those credits should count because we don't think they're legit. We're going to have some interesting experiences in bringing the subnational pieces in. It's one of the areas where in sort of creative foreign policy right now broadly that I think is most deserving of thought. US-China trade. So it was a really hot subject last year in particular to look at what we call carbon tariffs. If we have a cap and trade system and penalize people for emissions, then this potentially disadvantages our energy-intensive trade-exposed manufacturers. So the idea is that we impose a price at the border to level the playing field. Firstly, the danger is overstated, at least in the near term. There's an excellent Peterson Institute study that addresses that. The second thing, and I think is the most important, is that no one is imposing trade barriers to compensate for a cap and trade system in the United States if there is no cap and trade system in the United States. That is the main reason that this is off the table for the foreseeable future. The most likely way forward to return is if Europe resurrects its threat to impose carbon tariffs on the United States, which is where this idea originally came from. Okay? And frankly, that's also where some of the original motivation for middle-of-the-road politicians to take domestic action was. I do think there will be trade fights over clean energy technologies. There are already significant barriers in China, and there are significant ones being contemplated in the United States. I think that is where the trade conflict potentially lies. Are there further constraints to action than the economy? So I can rephrase that as, is this a nasty political situation? Is it not just an economic situation? Obviously, this is tied up in politics right now. And in the current political environment, you will not change things. I would like to think that the political environment will moderate somewhat if the economy gets better. But again, this is part of why you need to establish the foundations. I know a lot of, I would say, not even necessarily sort of centrist Republicans, but middle-of-the-road Republicans who will say to me, cap and trade was a Republican idea, but we can't say it anymore. Sorry. So you need to rebuild things. You need to find different approaches. But I don't think you can find a wholesale different approach. I mean, the idea, for example, that we're going to do this all through a technology push and that everyone will buy in, it sounds appealing, but it doesn't actually deal with the problem. And there are reasons people were attracted to some of these earlier approaches. They actually have a lighter hand on the economy than some of the ones that sound better. So yes, you need a different political environment as well. Last question, 17% cut by 2020. I think it certainly is possible without cap and trade. Abundant natural gas resources make it substantially easier to reach, though not trivial. It still requires policy. People talk about how you need cap and trade to make deep cuts, and I think that's true to do it. You need a broad price signal to make very deep cuts in an economically sensible way. But 17% from 2005 isn't that deep a cut. You can target particular parts of the economy. I think the Obama administration's effort to move forward a clean energy standard could be an interesting way. I don't see it happening in the next couple years. But as long as people see the prospect of something like that, they will at least be deterred from making very long-term investments in coal-fired power plants that will be around for an extremely long time. So what I would say is, you can get to 17%. I'm not going to give you odds on it. But there are a lot of ways to slice that. Delivering the money that people were talking about in Copenhagen and Cancun is all but impossible without a cap and trade system. I think that we have to be very honest about, and we have to anticipate the consequences of that reality.
Why Cancun?
Pardon?
Why was it moved to Cancun? Last question.
Why was it moved to Cancun? The mayor of Mexico City is very green, and the president is very green, and he didn't want the mayor of Mexico City to have my read of the situation is that he didn't want the mayor of Mexico City to have a great showcase. And so it came down to two other places. I can't remember the other one, but they remembered that Copenhagen had big security problems, and Cancun was used to dealing with security. The downside is that Cancun's claim to fame has two claims to fame. I mean, one is as a place to go for spring break, and the other, in the nerdier global governance world, is a place where WTO negotiations go to fail. And so they didn't want to set up that headline, but it was the best of a bad set of options.
Well, I want to ask one final question to wrap up, and then take the moderator's prerogative. If you had 30 seconds in the elevator with the president and maybe heads of environmental groups and some business leaders, what would you say to them as the most appropriate steps next forward to try and get out?
It's a crowded elevator.
Yeah, well, it's going to hell. It looks like it's headed down. So.
To say, my current boss is Josh's former boss, and I assume taught him the "if you had 30 seconds with the president, what would you say?" question. Right now, I would say don't screw up shale gas. Right now, climate policy is a defensive play. The worst thing that can happen is to lock in long, extremely dirty investments. And the best way to deter that is to have an alternative to building coal plants that'll be around for a very, very long time. And right now, I see a brewing fight amongst people who are very anti-regulation and people who really want an anti-oil and gas victory, and not so much of a sensible middle that wants to find a compromise.
All right. Well, we'll have to leave it at that. We'll thank all of you, and we'll look forward to your continued observations. Thanks much.